Hi, everyone. Michael Tremblay here on a solo episode of Stoic Conversations. For today's episode, I'm going to break down Epictetus's Handbook 26. So, a short passage by Epictetus, and then we'll dig into it in further detail. And I thought this would be a fun opportunity to just go in more detail into what Epictetus says here. These are always these passages where there's a couple different things going on. So it's always really worth digging into each line and going over it. And that's what we'll do today. This is a great one about really getting the right perspective on things and how changing our view about something can improve the way that we relate to it. So I'll jump right into it. This is Epictetus's Handbook 26. Epictetus says, "The will of nature may be learned from those things in which we don't differ from each other. For example, when our neighbor's boy breaks a cup or the like, we are presently ready to say, 'These things will happen.' Be assured then that when your own cup likewise is broken, you ought to be affected just as when another's cup was broken. Apply this in like manner to greater things. Is the child or wife of another dead? There is no one who would not say, 'This is a human accident.' But if anyone's own child happens to die, it's presently, 'Alas, how wretched am I?' But it should be remembered how we are affected in hearing the same thing concerning others." And so that's Handbook 26. And again, Epictetus's Handbook is kind of his greatest hits, summarized by one of his students. And so I wanted to start and say, well, what is this passage actually saying? What are the key takeaways we should take from this? And then connect that with some other ideas in Stoicism. So the first key idea here is about the will of nature. And that's the first line Epictetus uses. He says, "The will of nature may be learned from those things in which we don't differ from each other." And what's the point here? What is the will of nature? Well, Epictetus's point is that when he says the will of nature, he really means there are some facts about the world. There are some truths about the way the world is. And if we want to learn those facts, if we want to learn those truths, we can do that by observing other people and observing them, especially concerning things that relate to our own lives or that we have in common, right? So if I'm not an artist, I can maybe learn something from observing an artist, but it doesn't necessarily relate to my life if I'm a carpenter. But if I want to learn facts about the world in relation to, having a family, life and death, things like this, I can learn about those things just by watching other humans go through them. And the point here is that every person's life, it involves accidents. That's just a fact of nature. That's part of the will of nature, as Epictetus would say. If you have a family, there will be deaths, either of those of your parents or grandparents that are older than you, or sometimes of your wife or husband, and then sometimes even of your children. Everybody makes mistakes. That's another thing. Gets in fights, does things they regret. These are all just facts of the world. And then that's what Epictetus is calling the will of nature, is really truths about the way human life is, the way things must occur. And so if we want to understand those things and know what those facts are, we can do that by observing other people and observing them specifically in terms of what they share with us, in terms of what we have in common. So in this example, it's somebody's child breaking a cup. We maybe don't covet our cups as much as we did back then. We maybe have other things, but you can think of somebody's your son or daughter denting the car, breaking something that you find valuable. That's just part of having kids. That's just a fact of the world. And then the other example, he says, the more serious example is the death of your child or your husband or your wife. So that's the will of nature. The first part is, look, we can learn about that just from observing other people. By watching other people live their lives, we can know more about what life entails. The second key idea here, though, is that Stoicism is about living life in accordance with nature. And so that connects to this idea of the will of nature, which is to say we want to live our life in accordance with the will of nature, not fight against it. So Stoicism is has a lot to say about trying to reduce the friction of our lives. And they think that a main source of our unhappiness, a main source of our suffering comes from friction when we fight against things that are outside of our control, and especially things that are outside of our control that are necessary parts of life. So if we find ourselves, take the example of the child breaking the cup, if we find ourselves totally surprised and totally unprepared to think that our children will ever do something inconvenient, ever harm any of our possessions, if we find ourselves in that position where we're just like, I'm so mad. I'm so mad at my son or daughter for breaking my favorite cup. Epictetus would say this is an example of living out of accordance with nature, because the only kind of person that would be that upset is a person who didn't suspect it, didn't anticipate it, didn't think it was something that could happen and likely would happen. And so by being oblivious to the fact that children will wreck possessions from time to time, or damage things that you own, you've put yourself out of accordance with nature, and you've created this kind of friction, and the consequence of that friction is your suffering, it's your unhappiness. And so the goal of Stoicism then is to get in accordance with nature, which is to say when your child breaks your favorite cup, you say, well, accidents happen. That things will break from time to time. That's the way it goes. It was not in my control for this cup to be unbroken. No one ever promised me this cup would never be broken. And that's someone who's living in accordance with nature. That's someone who is not at friction with this event. And obviously, it's easy when you talk about the cup, but Epictetus is talking about also training ourselves up to adopting that same perspective when our family members die, which is probably one of the most complicated and difficult lessons. But it would be the same example with the death of a family member, which is to say, instead of the friction of how could this ever happen to me? This is not something that you anticipated. This is not something you prepared for. Instead, this is a terrible thing, but it's also a fact of the way the world works. And because of that, I was prepared for that, and I accounted for it. And so the goal of Stoicism is to get to that second state, to be in accordance with nature, to reduce the friction between yourself and the way the world is. And how we do that, how do we live in accordance with nature, is an important question for the Stoics. And the point of this passage is really an exercise to do that. It's to live in accordance with nature. And the exercise that Epictetus is pointing out is that we should observe carefully, actually, not how we react to situations in our own lives, but actually how we react to the situations in the lives of others. So there's some information to be gained when somebody scratches your car, for example. There's some information to be gained there in terms of how you react to the situation. But actually, why don't you turn to how you react when that happens to somebody else? When that happens to your neighbor or a friend of yours, somebody you care about, but is not in your immediate circle of your family. How do we react? And Epictetus points out, I think quite rightly, and this was 2,000 years ago, but I think it's the truth about how we react today, is we have this perspective where we're almost a step removed. We say, well, these things happen. A car got scratched because your son or daughter were driving it, and they're not the most experienced driver. And, accidents happen. People make mistakes. That's not something we should let ruin our day, if not our month or our year. And Epictetus's point is that that's actually the right perspective. You've actually adopted a perspective in accordance with nature there. And we're actually quite good at doing that with other people. We're really good at understanding, don't be frivolous with your things. Don't go around breaking your cups. But if a cup breaks, that's to be expected to a certain degree. That will happen every once in a while. And the same thing with the larger issues of death and tragedy. When these things happen to other people, we recognize that they're sad, but not unexpected. We accept them as a part of life, something to be mourned, but not to ruin your life, not to ruin an extended period of time, to mourn appropriately. I think as Seneca would say, to cry but not to weep. And we're quite good at applying that to other people. I think if you think of going to the funeral of a different family, that's something that it's very, very sad. It's a very, very sad thing to do. But we're often able to maintain a better perspective, in the Stoic view at least, the correct perspective of this is a really, really sad thing, but not unexpected. Something that happens and a part of life. And so the point of this passage from Epictetus is to say, look to do that to yourself. Take what you do a good job of applying to other people and apply that to yourself. So to read that again, as Epictetus says, when our neighbor's boy breaks a cup or the like, we are presently ready to say these things happen. Be assured then, when your own cup likewise is broken, you ought to be affected just as when another's cup was broken. Apply this in like manner to greater things. Is the child or wife of another dead? There is no one who would not say this is a human accident. But if anyone's own child happens to die, it is presently, alas, how wretched am I? And so Epictetus is talking that disproportionality is what he's calling out. It is not any more of a terrible thing because it happened to you. That's a mistake you're making. You're losing perspective by focusing on your individual circumstance, your individual cup, or your individual family. And I think what I like about this passage is the point is it's not that we are unsympathetic to other people, right? It's not that, I care about my own possessions as much as I should, and I don't care about my neighbor's cup. I'm the point is not that I'm disrespectful to my neighbor, that I don't care that they broke their cup. The point is that I've actually achieved the right degree of caring in that case. I've achieved the right amount of perspective, and that I actually have become overly attached to my own cup, or I've lost this perspective in my own case. We lose that perspective with our own family, that they're humans, and humans will experience the things humans experience, like sickness and death. And so we've lost that perspective in our own case. And it is not that we are callous when we don't feel the same thing towards our neighbors. It's that's we're actually overly maybe self-oriented with our own hardships and our own problems. And so that's what Epictetus is saying in this passage. And how do we connect it to Stoicism more broadly? Well, the point I wanted to make is that Stoicism says that our happiness is about knowledge. So happiness is about knowledge. And what that means for the Stoics is that happiness is about how we think about the world. If we think about the world in the right way, then we will be happy and we will flourish. This comes back to Epictetus' dichotomy of control. If we think about things that are not up to us as being up to us, our reputation, our body, our wealth, if we treat those things like we can control them, we will suffer because we can't control them. And if we neglect the things that we can control, like our character, our behavior, if we neglect the things that are up to us, we will suffer because we won't pay as much attention to them as we should. So that's an example of how our happiness depends on knowledge. Because it's a matter of how we relate to the things, we understand the things in our lives, that's the changing the outcomes of our lives, not Not whether or not we get that promotion, not whether or not those people like us, not how much money we accumulate. It's about the way that we relate to the things happening to us. And so that's a big part of what the Stoics mean by saying that happiness is knowledge. And another part of knowledge is actually perspective. So the way you think about the same event is what I mean by perspective. So the cup has broken. That is a factual statement, and you can be incorrect about factual statements. You can think your cup has broken when it hasn't. You can think somebody is sick or likely to die when they aren't. And so you can make these kind of factual mistakes, and those can lead us to suffering. As Seneca says, we suffer more in imagination than reality, but often we suffer not because of these factual errors. We don't deviate with Stoic knowledge because of these factual errors. We deviate with Stoic knowledge because of the way we relate to what we accept as fact. So everybody in the room accepts that the cup is broken, but people have a different perspective about it. They think that it means different things. They give it different importance depending on what they thought about the cup or how much they anticipated this event to happen. And so a lot of Stoicism is about changing that perspective. And that's what living in accordance with nature is. It's having your perspective correspond with nature, having your perspective line up with the way things really are. So when things happen, you don't have that friction I talked about earlier. You're not confused, surprised, depressed about it. And so the Stoics give us a lot of different tools for doing this, right? Give us tools for having the right perspective. Memento mori is one of those tools. That's remembering that you will die. It's about keeping death in view. That is a strategy about perspective. It's about not forgetting about the inevitability of death, right? The view from above is another perspective shifting exercise, I would say. Well, that's the one where when you're particularly stressed or frustrated at something, you imagine yourself looking down from the clouds at the situation, looking down at yourself from above, and say, well, when I've zoomed out, I've taken myself out of that first person perspective, is it still frustrating? Do I still give it the same amount of importance? And so these are these almost meditative exercises we can practice to shift our perspective and gain some control over that perspective. And so what's this passage? This is Epictetus giving us another kind of exercise. This is Epictetus giving us another perspective shifting exercise. So often we can be more objective and more correct in our perspective when we reflect on situations as they occur to those we care about, but are not personally invested in or too personally invested in. That's the insight, is that, look, if I want to know how I should think about getting fired, how would I feel if my friend Jim got fired? I probably wouldn't say Jim's life is over. I probably wouldn't say his career aspirations are ruined. What is he going to do? I would say, oh, that's really upsetting. That's probably going to be a difficult couple months. Things financially, depending on Jim's situation, might be difficult for a period of time, even leading to, some sort of debt or loans in some situations, things you wouldn't want to do. But probably he's going to get a different job, maybe even a job he likes more, maybe even a job that pays better. And in that sense, it's not necessarily long-term even a bad thing, even though it might be short-term quite difficult. That's what I might say if it happens to a friend. But can we apply that own perspective to ourselves? That's Epictetus' advice, is do that to yourself. I think about this also in terms of relationship advice. How easy is it for us to tell our friends they should dump somebody who cheats on them? We look at our friends and we say, why are they with that person? They that person doesn't treat them well. They could do better. We apply that perspective to other people. We don't apply that perspective to ourselves. And so that's Epictetus' exercise here. Can we apply to ourselves the same standard that we apply to our neighbors and our friends? Can we apply to ourselves the same perspective that we give to people we care about, but are not so close to us that we lose that perspective? And I think that's an interesting part of Stoicism, is that perspective shift, which is to say, You're trying to live in accordance with nature. You're trying to do that by understanding the way things really are. And so how do you understand the way things really are? Well, look at other people, and you will see what happens in a human life. You will see cups getting broken. You will see family members dying. You will see breakups and frustrations with careers. You will see other things and the things we share in common. And then, well, how should you relate to those things? How should you relate to those inevitable parts of our lives, what Epictetus calls the will of nature? Well, you should relate to them in terms of how we relate to people that we care about but are not ourselves, which is we often take a pretty appropriate perspective. We have that appropriate perspective within ourselves. We just need to apply it to ourselves because we have no problem applying it to other people. And I think that's a great lesson. I think that's a really interesting idea Epictetus is speaking to. And regardless of how stoic you are, maybe you're fully stoic, maybe you're not, maybe you're just you like some of the ideas, maybe you fully committed to it as a life philosophy. There's an insight there. There's an insight about I think the key insight that I take from this passage is often when things happen to us, we think, how can I think about this? What's the right way to think about this? This is just so upsetting. I don't have any way to properly contextualize it. I'm so confused. I don't know how to think about it. And Epictetus is pointing out, you do know how to think about it. Just how would you think about it if it happened to your friend? How would you think about it if it happened to your neighbor? And so he's kind of pointing out to us that not only do we make this mistake by focusing on our own situations and acting like they're different than when they happen to other people, but we actually have a lot of the answers already. We just need to successfully apply them like the way we can apply them to other people. And yeah, that's a good lesson. One that I learned even before studying Stoicism or practicing Stoicism was this idea of, how would you, in terms of like self-talk, in terms of speaking to yourself positively, I often think, speak to yourself the way you would speak to a friend. So if you find yourself being overly negative to yourself, you criticizing yourself, I often think, what would I talk to my friend like this? Would I criticize my friend if they made a mistake? And that's the same kind of exercise Epictetus is recommending here, except that kind of positive self-talk exercise I was talking about, I would say not being overly critical on yourself. This, I think, is about not focusing on not losing perspective that you are actually not the first person to encounter these things. So almost like not taking yourself too seriously, right? Like you are not the first person who's had their cup broken. You are not the first person to have a family member die. As trivial as that might sound, or to have lose your job, or to go through a bad breakup, you're not the first person to encounter these things. And so that doesn't trivialize them. That doesn't mean they don't matter. But what it means is that, how have other people handled it? And how do you think of these things when they occur to other people? And you can use that as a source of knowledge and inspiration for how you can handle it and how you can deal with it. So that is the breakdown of Epictetus's Handbook 26. A lot of ideas in there. I think going back to these key ideas, living in accordance with nature is always something to think about when you think about the goal of Stoicism. How do I get my perspective so there's as little friction with the way things must be, what Epictetus calls here the will of nature, with how things must be and how I relate to them, and how much of my suffering or my unhappiness is because I'm wanting things to be different. I'm wanting to have children that never frustrate me or break my possessions. I want to have family members that never get sick. And, any time you have those perspectives, you want to love a human and have them never get sick. You want to have children that never frustrate you. When you have these kind of perspectives, you're actually getting out of accordance with nature. It feels good in the moment, but it takes you out of accordance with nature. And that's when it leads to suffering. And so Epictetus is saying here, look, if you want to have the right perspective, the perspective that's in accordance with nature, and understand the things in relation to the things that all humans experience, just look at how we treat our friends and our neighbors when these things happen to them. And so with that in mind, I'm going to read the passage one last time. We'll end with that. And now hopefully there's a bit more context behind it, a bit more of an understanding of what Epictetus is getting at here. So again, this is Handbook 26. The will of nature may be learned from those things in which we don't differ from each other. For example, when our neighbor's boy breaks a cup or the like, we are presently ready to say, these things will happen. Be assured then, when your own cup likewise is broken, you ought to be affected just as when another's cup was broken. Apply this in like manner to greater things. Is the child or wife of another dead? There is no one who would not say this is a human accident. But if anyone's own child happens to die, it is presently, alas, how wretched am I. But it should be remembered how we are affected in hearing the same thing concerning others.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.